Welcome to another episode of TimeShift America. Where are we off to today as we take a virtual road trip back through time? Let's enter the server room and decipher our latitude and longitude. And today it is latitude 42 degrees, 26 minutes and 32 seconds. And the longitude is 83 degrees, 9 minutes and 57 seconds. We're zooming in to northwest Detroit and the area of 8 Mile Road and Wyoming Avenue. We're in the Alfonso Wells Memorial Park off of Birwood Street, just south of 8 Mile Road, where there stands a picnic table today. Once stood a family home. That wall in the background, that's the focus of our time shift today. And the homes beyond the wall, as we time shift now back to 1941. The house number is 20,175 Birwood, children playing in a pile of earth, corn and vegetables growing in the front and side yards. But that wall back there, that wall had just been constructed. Let's explore this 6-foot-high concrete wall that extends for a half mile in northwest Detroit's 8 Mile, Wyoming neighborhood. It was built to physically separate established black neighborhoods from a new housing development intended for whites only. The year 1941 also stands as a landmark moment in American history. For on December 7th of 1941,
a date which will live in infamy,
remarked President Franklin Delano Roosevelt in his speech to Congress following Japan's surprise attack on the American naval base at Pearl Harbor, killing almost 3,000 Americans and officially bringing the United States into World War II.
Exploded the forward magazine.
However, to understand the infamous concrete landmark of the Birwood Wall, we must travel back to 1917. The US was entering World War I, then known as the Great War. At that time, the United States Army had just over 100,000 men ready for combat, far short of the numbers necessary to enter the war, which began 3 years earlier. In 1917, Congress enacted the Selective Service Act, and by 1918, men aged between 18 and 30 were eligible to be drafted to further strengthen American military forces fighting in Europe. With limited opportunities for black men in the military, the country had some reckoning to do. The men wanted to serve and lobbied the government for the right to do so. Finally, in May of 1917, in this letter to President Wilson, the Secretary of War states, "A training camp for colored people ought to be established," and so it was in Fort Des Moines, Iowa. Of the 4.8 million Americans that served in World War I, 2 million had volunteered, and 2.8 million had been drafted. However, only 350,000 black Americans served, albeit in segregated divisions. Notably, about 10% of Michigan's male population, or 135,000, mostly white men, joined the war effort. Discriminatory policies by local draft boards prevented many black Americans from being selected into military service. With so many white men going to war, there was increased job opportunities for women and people of color across the state, especially in the Detroit area, and thanks to its burgeoning auto industry. Additionally, the Great Migration of African Americans fleeing the discriminatory Jim Crow laws and the economic hardships of the South moved to cities in the north and east by the tens of thousands, including Detroit. The economic wealth gained during this time allowed many black families to get on the home ownership ladder, although some could only afford land with dreams to build homes at a later date. Following World War I and with the return of the 130,000 Michigan soldiers, competition for real estate continued through the 1920s. At the time, most of the city's black population was crowded into two segregated neighborhoods, Black Bottom and Paradise Valley. They were once thriving communities with hundreds of black-owned businesses. Black Bottom extended from the Detroit River north to Gratiot Avenue. Paradise Valley was just north of Black Bottom, on land now occupied by the Detroit Lions and Tigers. There were a few middle and working class enclaves of black American families living in less developed areas of Detroit, such as here in the West 8 Mile, Wyoming area. Settled by working-class black families in the early 1920s, it was originally called Greenfield Township prior to the expansion and annexation by the city of Detroit in 1925. When the Great Depression of the 1930s put almost all Americans at risk of losing their homes due to the inability to find work and make their house payments, the federal government stepped in to assist.
The Congress is about to pass legislation that will greatly ease the mortgage distress among the farmers and among the homeowners of the nation.
Through President Roosevelt's New Deal programs to provide economic relief to homeowners, the Homeowners Loan Corporation was created in 1933, and then the Federal Housing Administration came along in 1934.
All over the country, thousands of new building permits are being tacked up.
The purpose of these programs was to stabilize the housing market. One governmental scheme was to modify the payments and extend the length of the payment period to ease the financial burden on homeowners.
A building boom means a business boom and greater prosperity for all of us.
The Federal Housing Administration saw the U.S. government issuing low-interest loans to first-time homebuyers.
This tidal wave of new construction is an important contribution to the economic rebuilding of America.
To make the program work efficiently and avoid wasting money, local real estate agents were enlisted to value homes across the country. In Detroit, color-coded maps with letter grades were created with the intent to reflect the value of residential neighborhoods based on the condition of the homes and their residents. Green and blue for the safest neighborhoods where homes were well maintained and sales were high. Yellow or red for the riskiest neighborhoods. In reality, African American neighborhoods, even well-maintained middle-class neighborhoods, were colored red on these maps. The red-colored areas established a system of excluding minority home ownership from getting the government loans based on racial makeup of their neighborhood rather than the conditions of their homes. Basically, if a neighborhood had people of color living there, it was marked red. Decades later, in the 1960s, sociologist John McKnight coined the term for this discriminatory practice: redlining. To be clear, here's how Merriam-Webster's dictionary defines redlining: the illegal practice of refusing to offer credit or insurance in a particular community on a discriminatory basis, as because of race or ethnicity of its residents. Developers were eyeing the land just west of Birwood, but needed funding from the FHA to start construction. Initially denied the money, the FHA eventually approved a loan to the company on the condition a physical barrier be built between the black community and the soon-to-be-built all-white community. At the same time that divided community was being constructed in northwest Detroit, the United States was gearing up for war.
We interrupt this broadcast to bring you this important bulletin from the United Press. Flash, Washington. The White House announces Japanese attack on Pearl Harbor.
Detroit famously became known as the Arsenal of Democracy.
And the assembly lines of the automobile industry now become assembly lines of defense.
Demand for workers was high, as many had left for war, leaving behind women and many people of color who contributed to the war effort back home. While the Tuskegee Airmen, an all-black American elite flying force, 40 of whom were from the city of Detroit, were flying and dying for freedom abroad, their colored brethren back home were fighting for their freedom and for the same privilege of their white countrymen. Racial strife and violence was a serious issue on the home front in many large northern cities, especially Detroit. Police and federal troops would be needed to quell violence in 1942 and 43. With a housing shortage in Detroit, all levels of government stepped in to approve and build what turned out to be a highly controversial new development called the Sojourner Truth housing project. It was met with protests, harassment, even violence. Police protection was necessary to escort the moving vans. The racial unrest ended with dozens injured and hundreds arrested. A year later, racially motivated violence once again erupted, this time on Belle Isle, engulfing the city and most notably in Black Bottom, culminating with 34 dead, the majority of whom were black. 5 years later, in 1948, housing inequity in segregated communities were ruled unconstitutional by the United States Supreme Court. Just as quickly as racial integration got underway, the process of white flight began. Following the riots of 1967, Detroit witnessed an exodus of Caucasians fleeing the city for the suburbs. Thus, De facto segregation, or choice of individual citizens, became the driving force in determining where black and white families were choosing to live. It was then that the wide divide of 8 Mile Boulevard became the latest symbolic dividing line between black and white. As time went on, the original intent of this relic was often forgotten. Today, it stands as firm as the day the cement dried over 80 years ago. The strength of this structure has outlasted the racial policies of almost a century ago. Today, the invisible walls of prejudice make the news as the struggle for civil rights continues in the form of social justice movements. As we time shift back to today, the home at 20175 Birwood is long gone. Those youngsters, well, they'll be in their 80s by now, and the wall still remains. In 2006, the wall gained a new purpose, a positive purpose. It became a canvas, illuminating the journey of the African American experience. The community says it must stay as a reminder of past injustices and the unfair way people were treated based solely on the color of their skin. We're bringing history to life on TimeShift America.